Welcome to Human Monsters.
Part 1. James Weybern Hall.
Practically defining the word irony, James Weybern Hall was born in a region known as Happy Valley. This district is situated in Faulkner County, Arkansas. James was one of 10 children, born in 1921. The family were relatively poor as farmers, with a patriarch who worked as a Baptist preacher part-time. Though he wouldn't always emulate his father, as a child James would imitate his father's preaching. This was no mere hobby. He would assemble some other kids in the forest nearby and preach to them from his own pulpit on a tree stump. Though many would have assumed that he was as deeply committed to Jesus as his father, the truth was that young James was fascinated by the status and prestige that came with the theatrics of being a preacher. It was a good way to become the center of attention and a surefire way to enjoy the view above the common man in his community. In fact, as he grew older, he became less and less committed to faith, and his attendance at church was checkered with absences. In the later years of his childhood, he spent more and more time at his maternal grandmother's house. She was known for being a hospitable woman with exceptional culinary talent. While he enjoyed the end product of her meal prep, the part of the process he found most interesting and compelling was the procurement of the meat. She grew her own vegetables and raised her own livestock. When it came time to get some chicken together, she would take to the barn and slaughter one with her bare hands. James would observe as she snapped the chicken's neck, bit off its head, and plucked all of the feathers. To his grandmother, this was just prep work, like slicing an onion. The experience made a profound impact on James. He was rapt with attention as he watched her kill animals. The slaughter and the wrangling of viscera was almost erotic for him. He wouldn't have missed it for the world. More speculation regarding James's homicidal tendencies involved the harsh discipline that was meted out to him by his father. James's cousin Connie lived nearby and witnessed his father dishing out brutal corporal punishment. On one occasion, his father didn't care for the way his son was speaking to him. So, he picked up a tree branch and whipped James with it. James was 10 years old, but Connie recalled that his father whipped him, quote, like an animal. As for his mother's side of the family, well, his grandparents were first cousins, and speculation had it that the mental illnesses that were common in the family may have been hereditary. James's sister Lucy suffered from congenital disabilities, so his father worried that the recessive genes were infecting his side of the family tree. James didn't cause his father a lot of concern. He did well in school and completed his chores as assigned. The only thing that appeared to be unusual about him was his height. He was exceptionally tall for his age. In fact, once he was in his early teens, he made it clear to his father and anybody else that he was not one to be messed with. James Weybern Hall would one day become known as the, quote, hitchhiker from hell. At the age of 14, he developed a tendency to disappear from his family's home for long periods. He would explore the countryside. He rode in the box cars of freight trains. Sometimes he would even go as far as to visit one of the surrounding states. There was no real purpose behind it all, except to satisfy his wanderlust. It wasn't all about high adventure, though. At times he sought work as he went about his travels. He went to Topeka, Kansas, to work on a farm cutting corn. He worked on a length of railroad track. The latter stint of labor didn't go so well. One of his colleagues dropped a length of railing, and it hit James in the head. He passed out from the blow and had to be taken home to recover. There could very well have been some brain damage, for many of those who knew him well in those days reported that he was never quite the same after the strike in the head. 1937. James Weybern dropped out of school, having finished the 9th grade. James had no real plans for a profession. Instead, he was more than happy to live his life as a drifter. He had familiarized himself with the topography of Arkansas and its surrounding states to survive on his own without a steady income. Since the Great Depression, it had become common for young men to ride boxcars in search of work as laborers, so he didn't exactly stand out among the other young men of his time and place. Eventually, trains became antiquated as a means of transport for men of his ilk. Cars had proliferated on the nation's streets and highways, to the point that hitchhiking became the new way for drifters to make their way across the country. 1938. At the age of 17, James Weybern met the future Mrs. James Weybern, Wellesley McKee. He met her at church after a prolonged absence. She was a shy and socially awkward girl, and James took it upon himself to open the world up to her. Sure enough, he entertained her with his stories of riding boxcars and seeing other states. She had led a sheltered existence, so all this was very exciting to her. While he courted her and they developed a serious bond and relationship, he continued to roam, disappearing for weeks on end. What he didn't tell her was that he wasn't just a traveling farmhand. He also committed crimes to support himself, often in the form of robbery. He would hitchhike, and after the unsuspecting motorist had traveled a distance away while expecting nothing untoward from James, he would rob them at gunpoint. 1938. Soon it wasn't just money James was taking from his victims. They would eventually lose their lives along with it. The first victim of his killing streak was a woman he met while working as a farmhand in Salina, Kansas. She was a local vagrant and had asked James for money. According to James, after he refused to give her anything, she pulled out a knife and tried to extort it from him by force. He insisted that it was only after his life was in danger that he killed her in self-defense. Please note, James Hall was known to be a pathological liar, so some of the details should be taken with the proverbial grain of salt. It is therefore unknown if this murder even happened, but people who were close to James at the time did notice that he was very hard-boiled when he returned. It seemed as though something significant had happened to him that brought about that change. July 16th, 1939. James and Wellesley were married. James's father, Samuel Hall, presided over the wedding. James was permitted to rent a parcel of land from a local farmer. He worked the land as a sharecropper. Though they did not stand to draw in much of an income, Wellesley was excited to begin her new life as a wife and mother. James, however, soon grew restless. He wanted to get back on the road and see the world, or at least what could be found beyond the boundaries of Happy Valley. In fall of 1940, One night he told Wolsey that he would, quote, be back in a little while. He walked off their parcel of land and disappeared for what Wolsey would have defined as an undetermined period of time. She would struggle to sleep at night, wondering if something had happened to him. He would send a postcard home after about 2 weeks, so she would know he still existed. The postcard was sent from Galveston Harbor in the Gulf of Mexico. All he wrote was that he had business to take care of and would be back soon. Christmas Day. James returned home. It wasn't Wolsey's nature to be demanding, but she pressed James to tell her where he had been. He told her he had been to, quote, no place special, and asked her if she received his postcard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an item that was wrapped in package paper. He said it was a Christmas present. She opened it. It was a bolt of brocade fabric. At the time, it was a very expensive fabric and enough to make a dress. Wolsey was a skilled seamstress, so it was sure to find its way into her wardrobe. She was curious to know how he could have afforded the material at the time. Farmhands were not paid enough to squander their earnings on brocade. What she didn't know was that he was making more from the crimes than he ever did from working the fields. A year later, the humdrum routine and unchanging existence of farm life became too much for James to bear, and he disappeared again. It was hardly convenient for Wolsey. She was in a late-term pregnancy, and there was much work to be done in the field. Not the best time for James to abandon her and the farm. But that's exactly what he did when he said to her that he was, quote, going into town. She was suspicious. She said he didn't, quote, have any business going in town. After he was gone for a few days, she accepted the fact that she wouldn't see him again for a few weeks. Along with an imminent birth and crops to tend to, Wolsey approached James' parents for help. His father Samuel and his brother Lawrence took care of the harvest. Samuel was used to James's itinerant ways, but he found it embarrassing now that it put his grandchild in jeopardy. Years later, James would pillory his father, but despite the patriarch's faults, he came through for Wolsey when James failed both her and his child. James returned a month after his departure and acted like nothing unusual had happened. He reconciled with Wolsey. She lost the baby. He was deeply distraught over the loss, and they bonded over the loss of their child. Eventually, as winter petered out and the weather grew warmer, he took to the road again. A month later, James returned. He took Wolsey and his mother-in-law to England, Arkansas, that is. He earned some supplemental income as a sharecropper in England. It was hard work, and after his string of robberies, he soon grew tired of it. Eventually, he would move himself and the two women to Little Rock. There he worked as a taxi driver, and his wife obtained a position at a bakery. James would work as a cabbie intermittently for the rest of his life. It was under these circumstances that his family enjoyed the most stability. On May 11th, 1943, Wolsey gave birth to their son. The arrival of his first and only child was not enough to convince James to give up the disappearing act, and Wolsey could not accept it anymore. She put her foot down and demanded that he remain at home. The threat of divorce became a fixture of their conversations. They would separate later that year. Once James left Wolsey and their son, he made sure to keep up with the child support payments. It was a rare show of consistency for a man who seldom remained in one place for long. Fall of 1943. World War II was well underway, and the draft did not neglect James Hall. To Uncle Sam's disappointment, he was discharged soon after enlistment. The reason cited as being the cause of his termination from service was, quote unquote, indifference. This was a polite way of saying that James didn't fit into military culture due to his lack of self-discipline and tendency toward insubordination. 1944. James Hall was a free man. His marriage, parental responsibilities, and the military were not enough to keep him restrained. He would roam as he pleased, and there was nothing anybody could do to stop it. He met a new woman by the name of Fayreen, or Fay for short. He would go on to marry her. Unlike Wolsey, Fay was keen to join James on his adventures and insisted that he take her along. That he did, but it didn't always work out so well. Tensions would arise due to his jealousy, and if he caught her flirting with other men or even suspected her of it, he would become enraged. This became too much for her, and they separated. They tried once more to make the marriage work later that year, but when they were out to nightclubs, James would inevitably accuse Fay of flirting with other men, and they would have yet another row. He would become both verbally and physically abusive, and Fay would eventually decide to leave him for good, though not of her own volition. Fay was missing for a week. Her mother, Ada, decided to contact the police. A detective contacted James and asked him when the last time was that he saw Fay. Nobody knew exactly where it was that James had been at the time, so the investigation inquired about his place of employment, the Yellow and Checker Cab Taxi Company. 2 detectives went to the company, but were informed they had just missed Hall. They decided to wait until he returned. In the meantime, they questioned his supervisor, Fred Vernon. Vernon had nothing but nice things to say about James, except that he disappeared for long periods of time. He always welcomed him back because he was a good driver. James finally showed up, and the detectives questioned him about the disappearance of Fay. He knew it was coming since he had been the #1 person of interest in the investigation. He remained calm and answered all questions in a straightforward manner. Her friend Catherine Bryant was the last person to see her alive. They asked him, "What happened after you dropped Miss Bryant off?" James recalled that they drove home immediately afterward. He said they had been fighting that evening and that she stormed off to the bathroom after they returned. He said he left her alone for a few minutes to stew. After the end of that period, he checked on her. He said he was surprised to find she was not in the bathroom. The detectives asked him what he did next. James said he went to sleep. The detectives found this hard to believe. The guy's wife went missing, seemingly into thin air, and he was not only unconcerned, but went to sleep. He also said that she declared her intentions to leave for the West Coast. She had often threatened to leave him and had stated a preference for the West Coast before, so there was some truth to what he was telling them. He told them to consult with Fay's mother about the threats to leave for California if they didn't believe him. Catherine Bryant was contacted by Ada and verified for her that James and Fay had been fighting on the night of her disappearance. So far, nobody had a solid lead. A few days later, James paid a visit to Ada, whereupon he gave her Fay's clothing and asked Ada if she had spoken with police about Fay's disappearance. Ada said, I certainly have. And if I live 25 years more and don't find her, I'll keep going to him. November 3rd, 1944. Dr. Merrill E. Lambert and Corporal Charles Nipper III were both found dead in a ditch in Kansas. Both men's wallets were missing, so robbery was suspected. They were also shot multiple times. Meanwhile, James Hall arrived in California, living out Faye's dream. He forged a postcard in Faye's name and mailed it to Catherine Bryant. He wrote this message on the card: "Please tell Mom and all that it's really great out here, and I soon will feel settled and will write." When Catherine received the card, she just intuitively knew that there was something suspicious about it. She contacted Ada and told her about it. Ada, shortly thereafter, contacted the police and told them about the postcard. James returned from his sojourn in California and snatched the postcard away from Catherine Bryant. By doing so, he prevented the police from being able to process it as evidence. It was too late to bury his tracks now that the paper trail leading him through the investigation's history was lined with a postcard. The police managed to track down James and discuss the matter of the postcard. He didn't have it on his person, but vowed to submit it to them in the near future. Naturally, the postcard never found its way to the police. Despite his suspicious behavior, James was off the hook for the time being, since the police were not able to analyze the handwriting on the card. DNA was not an investigative tool at the time, but there were handwriting experts who worked with law enforcement agencies and were adept at detecting forgery. January 17th, 1945. The corpse of Carl Hamilton was found near a tree. It had been soaked with blood. This was another Kansas-based crime. The same month, a man named Doyle Mulheron was found murdered. He had been robbed and killed execution style. After the bullet was analyzed, it was found that it was a type that had been fired into the previously mentioned victims, who met their ends through gunfire. A new clue emerged in the investigations of these murders. People who had seen Doyle Mulheron the day he was killed recalled seeing him with a man resembling James Weybern Hall. Hall had been picked up by Mulheron while hitchhiking. He was even seen hanging around the scene of the crime. March 2nd, 1945. James Hall was arrested for getting into a brawl outside a bar. By the time the police arrived, James Hall had knocked his opponent unconscious. The man's name was William Blevins, and James Hall defined assault and battery with Blevins as his medium. Hall punched, kicked, and even stepped on him. Blevins was so badly injured, he had to be taken to hospital, where the recovery process took a month. Hall pled guilty and, through his gift of gab, managed to avoid prison time by paying court fines and fees. During his hearing, he made a point of telling the judge that he was a veteran and his father had been a preacher. He was doing his utmost to sell himself as a good American who had made an honest mistake. You could have almost smelled the apple pie. Someone called the police under the cloak of anonymity to give them a tip regarding the possible identity of the man who killed Carl Hamilton. Carl's body was found near Camden, and it was part of a highway that James Hall frequented throughout his travels. The man who gave this tip had a friend named Lonnie Blaine. Blaine agreed to let James Hall use his car prior to Carl Hamilton's death. Blaine, out of habit, kept a .45 caliber revolver for the purpose of self-defense. Taxi drivers are frequently targeted for armed robbery since the offender knows they have cash on hand. Considering this was decades before debit terminals, cash was all the drivers had on hand. Blaine left the gun in the car as a courtesy to the other drivers. When James Hall returned the car to Blaine, Blaine discovered that 2 rounds had been fired from the gun. Having made this discovery, he soon learned of the death of Carl Hamilton. He knew that Hall regularly commuted in the area where Hamilton's body was found. Initially, Lonnie was reluctant to report his suspicions, since it was his gun that may have been used, and he feared that he would be considered complicit as a suspect. In fact, before they learned of his real name, the mystery caller was considered to be a real possibility as an accomplice. However, no evidence could be unearthed to prove that more than one offender was responsible for the crime. So, he was dropped as a suspect. Nevertheless, this much information was reported to the police, and they were now getting closer to proving that James Weybern Hall had blood on his hands. The detectives paid another visit to the taxi company where James Hall worked. Once again, they waited for him to return after he was off working. When he saw them, he played it cool and played the part of concerned husband when he said, "Do you have any news about Faye?" The detectives told him they needed to talk to him downtown, that being the police precinct. He played it off like it was no big deal. He said, "Sure thing." En route to the police station, Hall assumed the matter at hand was related to the fist fight. These procedures don't usually take place once one has settled their legal matters. He was searched, fingerprinted, and mugshots were taken. From there, they escorted him to a jail cell where he was to be questioned. Before James Hall was questioned, the detectives went to the last place Hall lived to search the premises for damning evidence. It was a room he rented from a woman named Fanny Rose. Bingo. A .38 revolver. A gold watch with the initials JDN engraved into it. The initials of one of his victims. In the meantime, ballistics experts confirmed that the bullets fired into the murder victims were a match for those found as auxiliary ammunition in Lonnie Blaine's revolver. James Hall was brought downstairs to an interrogation room. When the detectives arrived, they were surprised that not only was Hall not nervous, but he was in jovial spirits. He even said, "I thought you guys had forgotten me." The officers were not amused. They didn't waste another second and began the interrogation. They started out by asking about Faye's disappearance. They wanted to know why she would just get up and leave on the fly and disappear. He claimed he didn't know why and said they would have to, quote, ask her. This enraged the investigators. One of them demanded to know what he did to Faye. He continued to deny that he had any involvement whatsoever in her disappearance, capping it off by saying, "I didn't do anything to her." They tried another tactic. He had a history of violence, including spousal abuse, and they felt it buttressed their theory that Faye had been physically abused by James. One of the detectives said, "You like to hit women, don't you?" James denied that he had ever done such a thing, not to Faye, not to anyone. They took another tack. They asked him general questions about his life. He went through his childhood on the farm and into the subject of his first marriage. The detectives were intrigued by his almost lifelong tendency to disappear for long periods. James had no explanation for the origins and existence of his wanderlust. The best explanation he could give was, "I get restless." Using this as a segue, One of the detectives questioned Hall about his most recent travels. He said, "Been out of town lately?" Before Hall could answer, one of the investigators shifted a piece of paper to reveal an article of evidence, the .38 revolver. Until then, Hall had been insouciant in the face of hard questioning. Now he squirmed from the intentions that arose within him. They continued to ask him questions about his recent travels. He said he went, quote, "No place special." The detectives continued to grill him, and eventually their efforts began to bear fruit. Hall broke out in a cold sweat, like lava spritzing from a volcano. Finally, he erupted with the confession the investigators were waiting for. "Okay, I'll tell you all about it. I killed them all." James Hall decided to try appealing to the detective's capacity for empathy, to negotiate his way out of being prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. He told them about the abuse he suffered as a child and how it crafted him into the cold-blooded killer he became as an adult. He said his first marriage ended in heartbreak. He also blamed Faye for his problems. Explaining this, he said, "I was crazy about her, but we soon began having trouble. I was driving a cab and making from $20 to $50 a night. She was wasting her money, and this caused many arguments." It was the next statement he made that served as his confession to Faye's murder. "I believe it was last September when I decided I'd had enough of it. So I took her out to the old river road near the Riverside Golf Course, led her into a ravine on the riverbank, and beat her to death with my hands." Detective Peterson asked him if he would lead them to where he left Faye's body. James Weybern Hall was sentenced to death for his crimes. He was executed on January 4th, 1946. Part 2. Jeffrey Wayne Gorton. Jeffrey Gorton was born on November 1st, 1962. By all accounts, his childhood was normal. His parents owned a prosperous landscaping business. When Jeffrey grew up, he continued his involvement in the family business. He would marry and procreate in his own right. He is one of those nobody saw it coming types. He was a family man straight out of a sitcom, and well liked by his neighbors. He was particularly remembered for the way he decorated his family's home. That is, every holiday, not just Christmas and Thanksgiving. This was the kind of guy you would expect to chastise you for swearing in front of the children. But doesn't that all sound a little too perfect? Wouldn't it be a perfect persona to hide behind? Say you had a very dark secret you were keeping from the world. A secret so dark, those same neighbors would create a committee to run you off the block. Those same unsuspecting neighbors would learn the secret one day. Until then, they lived amongst pure evil. Was everything so wholesome behind closed doors at Jeffrey Gorton's childhood home? A friend from those days described his parents as, quote, "cold and aloof." A person could be much worse than cold and aloof. Joe became close friends with Jeffrey's sister Nora as well. They were so close that sometimes he would hang out with her instead of Jeffrey. She noticed that a pair of her panties were missing one time after one of Joe's visits. It was never proven that he was the thief. Also, it was revealed years later that Jeffrey had a fetish for women's underwear. He especially liked them to be not only worn, but unwashed. As bizarre as that may sound to some people, There is an entire cottage industry of women selling their used and soiled undergarments to men who compensate them generously. So you can't link such a thing exclusively to serial killers and sex offenders. Jeffrey became popular as a teenager and was well liked in the town of Flint, Michigan. After getting his driver's license, he could often be seen driving his friends around town. At the time, he had a crush on a girl named Tina. It was through Tina that his companions got a glimpse of Jeffrey's dark side. One day he picked up some friends, Tina among them, and they went out for pizza. The problem from Jeffrey's point of view was that Tina refused to ride shotgun. He expected her presence beside him up there, and when she refused to sit up front, Jeffrey was so incensed by this that he turned around and took everyone home. The outing was canceled. His jealousy was a raging animal, and this was an occasion when the beast was unleashed. This behavior didn't just emerge in his relationships with women. Even with friends, he insisted upon complete control and determining the exact outcome of all proceedings. Jeff performed well at school, and as part of the track and field team, he got a part-time job aside from helping with the family business. In the early 1980s, roller skating was very popular, and Jeffrey met a girl at a rink called Roller World named Dawn Leon Terbach. Though her initial impression of him was that he was, quote, a little geeky, he was able to charm her until she became downright enchanted. Many women would have a comparable experience, with him charming them only for them to wonder much later how he accomplished such a feat. It was all fun and games until Dawn got pregnant. They became aware of this development in June of 1981. Jeffrey had graduated from high school. Dawn was 16. Jeffrey was hardly excited to hear this news. In confidence with friends, he cast doubt on the child's paternity. Dawn insisted he was the father because she hadn't had sex with any other boys at that time. Jeffrey reacted to her concern by becoming distant and even outright ignoring her. He took this to the extreme of enlisting in the Navy. His plan worked. After enlisting, he was stationed at a naval base in Florida. Dawn and her mother were so determined to make Jeffrey face the responsibility of raising his baby that they went all the way down to Orlando to confront him. The tactic worked, and Jeffrey embraced the role of father. In June, Jeffrey and Dawn flew back to Michigan to get married. The following day, Jeffrey, Dawn, and their son moved to Chicago, where Jeffrey resumed his naval training. Eventually, Jeffrey was transferred back to Orlando to train for a nuclear program. He was living a conventional life, complete with a straight-edge lifestyle devoid of even social substance use. On April 29th, 1983, Marie Gagliano had an experience that would affect her for the rest of her life. While unlocking the trunk of her car to remove some groceries, she was shocked to see a man she had encountered before, and he was as creepy as she remembered. This time, he put his hand up her skirt and grabbed her legs. As his hands made their way down to her calves, she leapt backwards, landing on her buttocks. The man grabbed her ankles and dragged her across the parking lot toward a dumpster. Marie began to scream to draw the attention of Good Samaritans. Some cars stopped, with their occupants directing their attention to Marie and the aggressor. Realizing he was likely to get caught, he reached under Marie's dress and yanked out her slip. He ran off. Throughout the next few days, other women would report having their undergarments stolen in a similar manner. Marie had been surprised by the appearance of the attacker. She described him as a, quote, Joe College type, too straight-laced upon first impression to come across as a common sex criminal. 2 military women reported that they, too, had been victims of these assaults, and that the perpetrator was wearing military-style dog tags. Now the military police became involved and launched an investigation. The crime was occurring in epidemic proportions. May 18th. The police received a call from a man who managed a trailer park. He complained about a resident, one Jeffrey Gorton. He said when Jeffrey moved in with his wife and child, everything was fine. But then his wife and child moved back to Michigan. It was at that point when Jeffrey seemed to go crazy. He noted that he would wander around the park and peep in residents' windows. Women reported that their undergarments were going missing, many of them from clotheslines. One day, the manager went into Gordon's trailer when he knew he would be away. He found grocery bags full of women's underwear, slips, and pantyhose. The manager was even more disturbed to find one of his daughter's panties in the bags. Jeffrey Gorton was charged initially with assault, but the charges were reduced to 2 counts of robbery and 1 for burglary. He was found guilty. He tried to elicit sympathy in the judge by claiming to have urges over which he had no control. He said, "I know I did something wrong, and I want to get help." This tactic did not have the intended result. He was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Jeffrey was released in less than 2 years in September 1985. November 9th, 1986. Margaret Eby was a professor at the University of Michigan at this time. She had 4 children. She was involved in the local music scene in terms of planning some of its events. Her children were grown, and her husband had passed away. She had plenty of time on her hands at the age of 50. Not only was she known to be highly intelligent and educated, but she was physically active and fit. Many remarked that she looked 10 years younger. She was remembered overall as a friendly person, but did not hesitate to voice her displeasure if she took exception to someone's remark or found somebody's work on a project to be substandard. On the morning of November 9th, 1986, Margaret's corpse was found in her home. It was tied to her bed. She had been brutally beaten. She had bled profusely. One curious finding noted by police was the absence of damage to the exterior of the house, which would indicate that a break-in has occurred. Officer Gary Alford made the following notes. The victim's bedroom was located west off the upper hall in the southwest corner of the upstairs of the house. The bedroom door opened inward and was hinged on the north. Hanging on the outside of the bedroom doorknob was a black/gray wool skirt. This skirt had 2 small drops of blood, one being on the folded edge toward the west and the other on the back. Hanging on the inside of the doorknob was a white plastic bag containing 2 pairs of women's underwear. There was a bed located approximately in the middle of the room from the south to north. The headboard was on the west wall.
and the bed extended to the east. On the bed was the body of a white female, later identified as Margaret Eby. She was lying on her stomach, nude, with her head at the northwest corner of the bed and her feet extending southeast to the middle of the bed. The victim's head was turned and facing south. The right arm was hanging over the north side of the bed, and the hand was touching the floor. Under the hand was a dried pool of blood measuring 10 inches north to south and 5 inches east to west. The victim's left arm was bent at the elbow, and the left hand was at the lower back. Both wrists showed signs of being bound. Both were reddish in color, with the right wrist showing a very definite impression, whereas the left wrist was more red. The left exposed side of the victim's face was blood-covered, along with the back of her head and hair. The blood also covered the top half of her back from the neck down. There was a massive wound to the victim's neck, and around the neck and partially in the wound was a gold neck chain. Next to the victim on the south side, under the left arm, was a leather watch band. Also next to the victim to the south was a yellow bathrobe. The robe's shoulder and neck area were lying in a pool of blood. A large concentration of partially wet and dry blood was on the mattress and under the victim. The concentration measures 3 feet north to south and 2.5 feet east to west. The victim appeared to have been moved from a position of lying on her back in the middle of the bed to the position that she was found. Folds on the blood-covered robe match bloody areas on the victim's back. The bed the victim was lying on consisted of a mattress, a box spring, and a metal frame. The frame was not attached to the headboard. The top blanket on the bed was brown, white, tan, and green striped with fringed edges. The second blanket was a white electric type. This blanket was in the on position and turned to number 7. Controls for the electric blanket were under the north side of the bed. There was a blue sheet on the mattress and 2 pillows on the head of the bed against the headboard. The pillowcases were blue in color with yellow flowers. Both pillowcases were blood-splattered. On the southeast bottom corner of the bed was a purple skirt draped over the edge. On the top of the bed was a beige tan woman's suit still on the hanger. The wall above the headboard and the headboard itself had several small blood splatterings on the bedroom's east wall. Extending south from the bedroom door was a dresser. Above the dresser, just to the south of the door, was located a light attached to the wall in the off position. Attached to the top of the dresser were 2 mirrors. On the top of the dresser was a laundry receipt for Pro Clean Laundry, orders of the victim, partially burned candles, 10 pieces of different colored candy, 2 pieces of bubble gum, and a large envelope addressed to Raymond Roth Flint Music. There appeared to be a small blood drop on the envelope. Also on the envelope was a piece of yellow cloth material, matching the yellow robe on the bed. On the carpet in front of the dresser was a pair of gray women's shoes. Next to the shoes on the carpet was a light plastic or rubber-covered wire, approximately 7 inches long. The wire had 3 insulated inner strands of red, green, and yellow. The south wall of the bedroom had a window covering approximately 1/2 east to west. There were no coverings on this window. West of the window was another dresser, and on top of the dresser was a clown figure that had earrings. On the front of the dresser, 2 feet 3 inches off the floor, were several small blood drops. Just north of the bed in the northwest corner was a glass-topped wood table, being used as a nightstand. On top of the table was a clock radio, 2 crumpled yellow tissues, a jar of moisturizing cream, and 2 books. Number 1 being entitled Special People. Written on the first page was a note from Lynn Roberts, dated 10/28/86. The number 2 book was entitled Falcon and the Snowman. The bottom shelf of the table had a white telephone, another jar of moisturizing cream, a box of yellow tissues. On the floor between the table and the wall was a plastic fly swatter. The victim was later turned over by Michigan State Police personnel, Wilmer and Thomas. The wound on the victim's neck was approximately 2 inches wide and covered approximately an area from ear to ear under the chin. The right side of the victim's face was blood-covered. The victim was wearing post-type earrings, along with a ring on the index finger of her right hand. The mark on her right wrist appeared to match the wire found on the floor. There also appeared to be a dried white substance in the vaginal opening of the victim. The victim's chest was also blood-covered. The yellow robe was moved, and the face of the watch was found on this robe. The yellow robe was missing the cuff on the left sleeve. The medical examiner would later report that the gaping wound on Ebby's neck was so deep it nearly reached the spinal cord. But the murderer used a serrated knife and would have had to have used it as a saw to inflict such damage. She was also stabbed in the chest. In the bathroom, a bloody fingerprint was found on a faucet. The print would not be useful at that time because it was incomplete. Nevertheless, it was entered into evidence. There was debate about whether Mrs. Ebby was alive or dead during most of the murder. 1989. Jeffrey had been dating a woman named Brenda Fleming. Eventually, their romance became a commitment, and they moved in together. He proposed to her in October 1989, on an occasion known in the American Midwest as Sweetest Day. Though Brenda was very much in love and was looking forward to getting married, she did have some misgivings. As she confided in a friend, she learned that during the time in Florida, when he was still in the Navy and married for the first time, Jeffrey was arrested and imprisoned for sex offenses. She paused at the yellow with that information for a moment of sober second thought, but ultimately she ran the red light anyway, and they were married in September 1990. As far as she could tell, it was a phase of his life when he was out of sorts, and his time in prison reformed him. At the time of their engagement, he was working and kept his life on the straight and narrow. As far as his sex life went, it appeared that he engaged in little activity beyond the parameters of their own bedroom. She chose to believe that his redemption would remain ongoing in perpetuity. After their honeymoon in Niagara Falls, Jeffrey and Brenda went on to start their new lives together, which included having children. Once again, a white picket fence encircled Jeffrey Gorton, as it belied the sinister backdrop of his secret second life. February 7th, 1991. Flight attendant Nancy Ludwig was an ad hoc employee, meaning she would be added to crews to fill in for absent stewardesses. On this day, she was assigned a room at the Hilton Hotel in Romulus, Michigan, as she awaited her following shift aboard. Also staying at the Hilton was a flight attendant named Ann Johnson. She was a very health-conscious woman and would find ways to incorporate exercise into her itinerant lifestyle. One way was to run laps up and down stairs, which she did in the Hilton on this day. Anne encountered a young man on the third floor. He had a canvas bag with him, and there was something about him that struck Anne as sketchy. He was dressed in jeans and tennis shoes, he had brown hair, he looked clean cut, yet something about his vibe raised red flags. Still, there were no clear-cut indicators that he was up to no good. Nevertheless, she went back to her room. She didn't want to take any chances in a stairwell with some strange man. A woman named Nancy happened to take a shuttle car to the Hilton that day, and a young man fitting that description sat down next to her as if he knew her. He didn't initiate a conversation, just sat there while there were other seating options. A man known in this investigation as Mr. Garcia saw the young man frantically stuff clothing into the trunk of a car. February 18th, a maid knocked on the door to room 354. She gave ample notice that she was there to clean the room. There was no response, so she assumed the coast was clear. There was more than the usual mess left behind by guests. Not an empty champagne bottle, no ashtrays filled with butts, no fast food containers. No, this was entirely different. There was blood all over the room, on the walls, on the floor, on the bed. The maid was shocked and horrified. She fled from the room immediately. She reported these findings to the manager. The manager took in the visage of room 354. Not only was he appalled by the sight of all the blood, after touching the guest's neck to feel for a pulse, he discovered that the guest expired before her reservation, and it had nothing to do with natural causes. He contacted the police. Ms. Ludwig's body was positioned so that her buttocks were pushed upwards. A particularly grisly finding was that a serrated knife was used to cut her neck. The murderer sawed her neck until she was nearly decapitated. There were bruises on her face. Her fingers were lacerated, with some cut so badly they were nearly severed. It was surmised by investigators that she did her utmost to retaliate against her attacker. Nancy's vagina was distended, indicating that she was raped immediately after her death. Swabs were conducted on Nancy's anal and vaginal cavities. There were indicators of multiple sexual assaults. She was also tied up with twine and placed on her back during the first rape. The assailant raped her as he pinned her to the bed. He tortured her as she struggled to break free from the restraints. At one point, the perpetrator took up a knife and etched the letter Z on her left breast. Following this, he took Nancy and brought her to the bed. He placed her on her stomach. It was assumed she was dead by then. He stuck pillows and other items from the bed underneath her torso so that her buttocks would be propped up. From there, he continued to rape her dead body. At one point, his semen leaked from her rectum and all over her buttocks. The technology that used fingerprints to identify perpetrators was not equipped to piece together partial prints in the 1980s. leaving many investigations incomplete. Years later, in the 2000s, when technology finally caught up and made this miracle possible, it became a mainstay of criminal investigations. January 24th, 2002. The partial fingerprint found at the scene of Margaret Eby was run through the latest computer software specializing in assembling and identifying fingerprints. In no time, the computer found a match: Jeffrey Gorton. Their next move was to have other DNA collected from the scene. That wouldn't be difficult since it was already stored and on file. The hard part would be getting a current DNA sample that was proven to have been taken from Jeffrey Gorton. They couldn't force him to do it, and he was legally entitled to refuse to do so. Instead, they would have to get him to give it up voluntarily somehow. One day, Jeffrey took his kids to a skating rink. As he was finishing a snack, a man asked him if he could have his tray. Gorton thought this was an unusual request, but gave him the tray nonetheless. The man was an undercover cop. He took the tray to a darkened corner of the arena and dumped the contents into an evidence bag. Later that year, Jeffrey Gorton was arrested for the rape and murder of Margaret Eby and Nancy Ludwig. The case for Nancy Ludwig went to trial. He was found guilty. He pled no contest to the Margaret Eby charges. Jeffrey Wayne Gorton was handed a life sentence with no possibility of parole. He remains in prison to this day. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.